My name is Jane Eliasoff, and thank you all for joining us tonight on this History at Home. And this is our 55th History at Home, so that's pretty cool. Before I go any further, I do want to thank the Albert Payson Terhune Foundation. They made tonight's program possible because they gave us a grant to have these slides digitized. And as Beth will get into, these are not the slides that you are used to seeing. These are very different. So to have them digitized really opens up a whole new look into Montclair from the late 19th, early 20th century. Thank you for your past support on these programs. It really has meant a lot to us. Even someone just before mentioned that her daughter and her 6-year-old granddaughter watch, and her 6-year-old granddaughter told them it was time to watch the history show tonight. So thank you to that and to 6-year-old girls who have a love of history. We hope to see you in 10 years when you're ready to intern with us. If you'd like to give us some financial support, you can do that. In 4 different ways. You can write a check to the Montclair History Center and send it to 108 Orange Road in Montclair, New Jersey. You can go on Venmo right now if you wanted to and look for Montclair History Center, and you can give to us that way. We also accept Zelle, and if you go on our website, www.montclairhistory.org, you can donate there as well. That's also the place to find the link to the YouTube channel, because all of the programs we've done, almost all of the programs we've done, are up on YouTube. So if you're ever bored one night and tired of Netflix, check out the Montclair History Center YouTube channel instead. I'm excited about tonight's program because when I got a glimpse of these slides, I was tickled by some of them. And Beth is going to tell you a little bit more about them as she moves on, but let me introduce her first. Beth Shepard has volunteered with us for many, many years. She is a professional archivist who is now working in Bergen County, and she has helped us rein in the many, many, many documents we have in our collection. She has been collecting lantern slides, which is what this presentation is all about tonight, for over 30 years. She wrote her master's thesis on Magic Lantern when she got her MA in Museum Studies at George Washington University. She started working at the George Eastman House, where she cataloged their lantern slide collection of over 15,000 images. Quite impressive. From 1996 to 2001, she was the local history archivist at the Montclair Public Library. You may recognize her last name. Her father was the town historian for many years, and she is a historian in her own right. And with that, I'm simply going to turn it over to Beth to walk us through these amazing lantern slides.
So I want to thank the History Center, first of all, for suggesting I do this program. I've actually used these slides several times in my Magic Lantern programs that I've done over the years. So it was fun to revisit again, because it's been a while since I've done a Magic Lantern show. I also wanted to thank Mike Farrelly and Helen Fallon. They were very helpful in doing some research on some of the slides that we're going to be showing. So I appreciated that as well. So today we're going to go on a little tour of Montclair through the lens of the Magic Lantern, through the William H. Crocker Lantern Slide Collection. Now, this collection was photographed or collected by Crocker from about 1895 to 1905. So some of the images were taken much earlier than that, and a few were taken later than that. Now, the provenance of these slides is sort of an interesting story. The slides were rediscovered in an attic at 525 Upper Mountain Avenue in 1963. And the house was the home of Crocker's niece, Florence Bunnell. And these slides were left behind. They were just left in this attic. And another owner came in and discovered them there. And they donated it to the public library. And it was kind of a big to-do at the time. They had several articles about it in the Montclair Times, tooting these discovery of unseen images of Montclair. And especially noted was the rare images of artists from the Montclair art colony. I would say that's probably the real gem of this collection. But since Aaron is going to be talking about the art colony in May, I agreed to not only show a few of the art colony slides and focus just on the Montclair images. So before we get to our tour, I wanted to put the slides into historical context. So I hope you indulge me a little bit and you find this rather lengthy introduction of interest. Since I collect slides, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what a magic lantern is and how these things were used in the 19th and early 20th century. So that would be part one. Part two, I'm going to talk about who Crocker was and some of the other people who took these photographs. And then part three, we'll finally get to our tour. So the lantern slide was the granddaddy of all projected images. So it was the granddaddy of film slides, movies, and even the PowerPoint presentations. The magic lantern projector was invented in the 17th century by Christian Huygens, who was a Dutch scientist. Now, in the 18th century, the magic lantern was used by itinerant lanternists who would just travel around Europe and also in colonial America, putting on these magic lantern shows. And the earlier machines, they kind of looked like lanterns. And they had little candle inside of them or a well-oiled lamp put inside. And the original slides were sort of hand-painted scenes on glass. Then in the late 18th century, rather, the magic lantern sort of moved into more of a public entertainment with these phantasmagoria shows, which were all the rage in Europe, especially in Paris, where they originated. As you can see here in this picture, that lantern is mounted on rollers. And when you roll the lantern closer to the screen, which is this point is a stretched piece of cloth or either a white wall at this point, it makes the image appear bigger and sort of jump out at people. And they would add a lot of smoke effects and scenes of ghosts and goblins, and it basically just terrorized people. People were fainting in their seats and screaming and carrying on, and it was just basically the first horror movie. So in the 19th century, the magic lantern had its heyday. And two reasons for that. One was the introduction of more powerful illuminants, namely kerosene, and then gas, and finally electricity. And then the other reason was photography was invented. So this machine, this picture here is showing you my toy kerosene projector. So these kerosene projectors would have a little kerosene burner put inside of the machine, and it originally would have a metal chimney sticking out of it. And they were a very popular toy well into the 20th century. The toy slides were chromolytic prints adhere to the glass. And the full-size kerosene projectors are about 2.5 size of this one. This is a miniature machine. And then the gas and electric machines were able to provide more powerful luminance. They could be shown from the back of a large hall and project an image in the front of the room. By the kerosene projector, was more for small settings. It didn't have as powerful as a throw light. And this was the picture of my electric machine that I used for my magic lantern shows. If you were doing this in person, I probably would be projecting these things on my electric machine. Now, the other mention was photography. So photographic lantern slides were developed in 1849 to 1850 by the Langenheim brothers in Philadelphia. And then around the same time, collodion wet plate glass negatives were invented. And between these two inventions, it made it possible for lantern slides to be mass produced. So any topic you could possibly think of, there's probably a lantern slide produced by these commercial companies that sprung up in Europe and America to produce these slides and projectors. So the top corner here, you see a rectangular glass slide. That is the typical American lantern slide. That's what the Crocker slides look like. And the European glass slides were square shaped and a little smaller. The one on the other corner, the wooden slide, was the type of slide that was used in these kerosene projectors. And then the two in the front are examples of the movable slides that create motion on the screen. So in the 19th century, it was continued to be a form mostly of entertainment. And there were professional lanternists that traveled around the country putting on magic lantern shows. But also because now everything was mass produced in the factories, you could either buy or rent a projector and a bunch of slides and put on your own show on your parlors. So the public shows often would include these special effects slides, and they would often feature these dissolving view lanterns, which would have two or more lenses. So a dissolving view is the fading in of one image and the fading out of another. You can still do that today in modern projectors. And that was a very popular special effect. The other special effect was the movable slides, which created motion on the screen. And this was long before movies were invented. We're talking about 4 decades before movies were even came on the scene. People were looking at motion on the screen for the use of lantern slides. Now, this is the example of a lever lantern slide, and when you move the lever, the little pickaxe goes up and down. Some of these other images were sort of comical in nature. One of the slides I had on the table there was a kaleidoscope slide, and you crank it, and it has a kaleidoscope effect to it. So there are all types of moving images. Now, these shows would often include illustrated songs, poems, and stories popular of the day. So somebody would sing a song, or they would recite a poem or tell a story, and then the slides would be illustrating the thing that they were reciting. So this is a slide from a set that I have that illustrates The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, so we're moving along here. Yeah, he's got on the wrong page here. Okay. All right. So then in the mid-19th century, slides they started using slides to illustrate public lectures on a variety of topics. And at first, there was a great deal of skepticism by certain speakers, particularly the more academic speakers, who saw people that use slides were just showmen trying to attract audiences to their lecture by using these slides. But over time, it became really the more popular type of lecture available. Now, lecturers could produce their own slides, or they could buy slides from these commercial companies and put together a lecture. Now, some of the lectures produced social causes, and probably the most notable in that category was the Temperance Movement. Now, this is showing a slide from the bottle, which tells a sad story of an alcoholic who goes insane and murders his wife. And then on the other side here is an example of a religious slide. So these slides moved into the churches. They were used to illustrate sermons, Sunday school lessons, and hymns. And this is showing you the Rock of Ages. That was the popular hymn of the day. So a set of slides would be illustrating the hymn as the congregation sang it. Probably the most popular of all the illustrated lecture was the travelogue. So the professional and amateur photographers would put together these travel lectures, or you could buy travel scenes from these commercial companies and put together your own travel journey. And through these armchair journeys, you could travel all over the world without leaving your parlor. But today we're going to go to Montclair. So here's the first of our Montclair slides showing downtown Montclair. And this is the way it would have appeared for most of the 19th century. This church was built in 1956. It was the first Presbyterian church. And it was the mother church of all the other Presbyterian churches in town, including the first Congregational church. And of course, as you can tell, it stood where the Hink building is today. Now, across the street was the Montclair Club. You can't see it in this picture, but that was a popular social club of the day. It started in 1887 and lasted until the 1920s. And they also rented out their space to other clubs. So undoubtedly, that would have been a place where all kinds of magic lantern programs would have taken place. So we can just try to imagine ourselves there in the Montclair Club, and we're looking out at the First Presbyterian Church, and we're looking at our lantern slide show. Now, the magic lantern was also used in the schools. Starting in the 1890s, it became very commonplace for the magic lantern to be used in classrooms from elementary to the university. So this was the beginning of the audiovisual departments in these schools, and large lantern slide libraries were created and utilized into education well into the 20th century. People were using slides for educational purposes. Now, there's a number of slides in this collection that were produced for the Montclair Board of Education. This is one of them. And this is sort of a typical education slide. That was called Husking Time in Montclair. And a lot of times they would have sort of occupational or industrial, sort of agricultural scenes. So that's somewhere in Montclair. So now we're going to move on to part two. Who was Crocker and who were these people that created these images? So these slides, like I said, some of the slides were produced for educational reasons, but most of them were produced by these amateur photographers to provide illustrations for their lectures, but also just to share their work and their images with other people that shared the passion of photography. Now, Crocker was an amateur photographer, and he was also a member of the Montclair Camera Club, which was founded in 1898. Now, amateur photography became really popular in the later half of the 19th century. Because it became a lot easier for people to take pictures. When photography first came on the scene, it was a very cumbersome task. Like the wet plate collodion negatives had to be, when you took your picture, you had to put your emulsion onto the glass plate. Then you had to take your picture, and then you had to immediately develop it right after taking it. So if you were an outdoor photographer, you had to lug around this darkroom with you, and they would set up field tents or have little wagons that they would roll around so they could develop their wet plate collodion negatives. So you can see it was a very cumbersome thing. Then in 1871, dry plate negatives came on the market, and they were produced on the factories, and they also could be developed whenever you wanted to. So that was some improvement, but still you had very heavy glass plate negatives that you were lugging around places. So in around 1888 and 89, George Eastman introduced the first of his Kodak roll film cameras. So that made it much easier for people to, the film cameras made it much easier for anybody to take a photograph. And then in the 1890s, he introduced the Brownies point and click camera. You didn't even have to develop your pictures. You just shipped it off to Kodak. They developed it for you and shipped it back with your picture prints. So it's really, you know, anybody could get involved in this hobby, and lots of people did. So anyway, the camera club and other amateur groups would collect lantern slides, assemble their lantern slide libraries, so they could share, their members could share their work with each other, so they could project their images at their monthly meetings. And they also exchanged lantern slides with other clubs all over the country. The Camera Club participated in the American Lantern Slide Interchange, which was based in Chicago, and they collected lantern slides from all over the country from these various clubs. And then they would pick out the best images, and they would sample these sets and then ship them back to the clubs. So in this way, you were not only sharing your work with your local friends at your local club level, but you shared your images with every other enthusiasts all over the country for these interchanges. Also, the Camera Club did annual lantern slide exhibitions where they would award prizes for the best images. In 1902, Crocker won best prize for his lantern slide portraits. Now, this picture is not one of the lantern slides. I had to borrow it from the library, but it shows some of the members of the club. So we see here Dr. Levy Helsley. He was a very prominent doctor in town. I. Seymour Crane. He was a prominent businessman. I think he ran a hardware store. And then there was Charles Pratt. I don't know who he was, and I don't know who the people are standing on the train there, but they were on an outing at Greenwood Lake. So in addition to producing these slides or gathering these slides as a mechanism for sharing his photography with his friends, Crocker also was producing lantern slides for his lectures. So this is a list from the Montclair Times of the various lectures he was giving. And you can see that some of these images in the Crocker collection are correlate to what I'm looking at here. For example, there's a lot of slides in New England that he probably used in this Paul Revere talk listed here. Also, there's a lot of slides of various sculptures, as well as I mentioned earlier, images of the Montclair artists that were used in lectures that he was giving with Jonathan Scott Hartley, one of the Montclair Art Colony artists. So this is Jonathan Scott Hartley, and they gave several lectures together on sculpture and what they called plastic art. And he was the son-in-law of George Innes Sr., who was probably the most well-known of the Montclair Art Colony artists. And he was a sculptor. He came to Montclair in 1885, and he married two of Innes's daughters. First, he married Rose, and then she passed away, and then he married her sister, Helen. So these are a couple of pictures that they probably used in those lectures. Now, Innes and Hartley lived at 157 and 159 Grove Street, and the houses were connected by a above-ground walkway where they would have an art gallery displaying some of their artwork. And then in the backyard, they had a studio, which they shared. Now, this image on the left here is a really rare image of Hartley in his studio. And that's just one of the many gems of the Montclair Art Colony pictures, and I'm sure Erin will show you a lot more in May. Look forward to that. Okay. So Crocker was married to Charity Spear, and Upper Montclair was originally called Speartown, and her family home was built in the 1780s and still stands just over the border in Little Falls at 612 or 612 Upper Mountain Avenue. The house was inherited by her brother Peter, shown here, and he apparently was quite a character. He ran the family tavern, was called the Sportsman Hotel in his home. He also liked to shoot crows in the backyard, and sometimes the house is called the Crow's Nest. So Crocker was listed as a bookkeeper in the city directories from 1896 to 1905, and he lived in the Montclair Heights section of Montclair. In 1905, Crocker got a job as the associate editor of the American Architect magazine in New York City, and he moved to New York. Eventually, he became the editor-in-chief of that magazine. And then in 1928, he sadly died in a car accident in Orlando, Florida, only a year after he retired there. Now, a few of the slides in his collection were taken by Dr. Morgan Ires, who was the first doctor in Upper Montclair when he moved here in 1876 after completing his medical degree from Columbia University. And he was very active in town affairs, including the Board of Education. He was also an amateur photographer, member of the Montclair Camera Club, and he also gave several lantern slide lectures that were listed in the Montclair Times. Even after he left Montclair to live in Boston in 1908, he came back to Montclair and was still giving lectures here. In 1894, he moved into his new home at 155 Lorraine Avenue. And today we know this house is being part of the Lacadia Academy. Now, another possible member of the Montclair Camera Club was William Van Thorn. Now, we weren't able to find anything about who William Van Thorn is. I don't think he lived in Montclair, but he left behind a couple of interesting pictures here. So on the left, we have 150 Montclair Avenue. The house was built in 1892 by Claus Hink. He was the younger brother of Christopher Hink. They were German immigrants, and they operated a dry goods store in New York. They came to Montclair in the 1880s, and they bought up a lot of property, particularly Christopher owned a lot of land on Grove Street between Waukegan and Oxford, and then from Grove going up the hill to Essex Way. That includes Christopher Street and Montclair Avenue. And eventually they sold off their property and developed it. And later, Claus Jr. Still lived in this house after his parents passed away. So I thought it was sort of an interesting house, and I also liked the little wagons in front of it. Now, the other picture is Waukegan Avenue and Valley Road. Now, these pictures were taken in 1909, and I was actually kind of surprised how rural Waukegan Avenue looked like in 1909. It still wasn't very developed at this point. You can still see the farmland that belonged to the Harrison farm, and part of that property became the Egremont Park. So one professional photographer in this collection is Edward Van Alterna, and he was a well-known photographer and lantern slide manufacturer based in New York. And from 1909 to 1919, he partnered with John Thor Scott in producing song slide sets for the movies. During the Nickelodeon silent movie era, the theaters would hire singers, and they would sing songs, and the slides would illustrate the song while they sang it. It was also a mechanism for selling sheet music, because supposedly people would get excited about it and rush out and buy the sheet music. Lantern slides were also used for advertisements, and they would even have sing-alongs. They would show the lyrics, and people could sing along with these songs. And then after he ended that partnership in 1919, he continued to produce mostly travel views until the 1940s. Now, before he got involved with that, he was just a young boy. And in 1888, he was starting his career. He had a job at an unknown studio in Brooklyn. And for some reason, he came out here to Upper Montclair. He was about maybe 16 or 17 years old at this point, and he took a couple of pictures. So one of the road is Bradmere Road. I believe that road intersects, connects Lorraine Avenue with South Mountain Avenue. It's over near the railroad. And then the other picture there is probably a railroad in Upper Montclair. So again, you can see how rural things were, particularly in Upper Montclair. Now, this is a picture that before they got involved with their song slide business, Scott and Van Alterna worked for the New York Education Department, and they ran around taking pictures for their lantern slide library. And my guess is, by looking at this, that this probably was taken for the New York Education Department, probably taken either in the late 1890s or the early 1900s. It's called Shearing Sheep in Montclair. So finally, we're ended with that lengthy introduction. I hope I wasn't too tedious for you. And we'll finally get to our tour. All right, so here we're going to start at the Upper Montclair Railroad Station. And it was built from the New York and Greenwood Railroad. And it ran from, that railroad ran from Jersey City to Greenwood Lake and passed through Montclair. Later it was bought up by the Erie Railroad. Now we're going to go up the top of the mountain. And this is the late 1890s. We're looking down on Bellevue Avenue. Okay, so we're going to try to use my cursor. I hope you can see the cursor. But in the foreground here, this is the Charles Anderson House. And then in front, you can see the land that he donated to Essex County for the Anderson Park. Then over here, you can see the second railroad station that was built for Erie Railroad, the one that burnt down maybe about a decade ago now, or 15 years or so ago. And that's seen over here. Lost my cursor. Then over here, we have a building right along where Anderson Park is today. That is the Cliffside Hose Fire Station that was built in 1887. And behind it is the building that looks like a trunk. That was built by Charles Anderson as a commercial building. They had various offices in it, and they had a hall, on the upper floors, and even the library rented some space in the early years when the library was trying to establish itself in Montclair. You can barely make out the St. James Church here. You'll see a better picture in a minute. And then way in the distance is Mount Hebron. So we're going to go down the hill now, and we're going to look closer at the corner of Valley and Bellevue. So here we are at the corner of Bellevue and Valley Road, and we're looking at the Speartown Schoolhouse, which was built in 1849. Now, they had an earlier school in this location that was built in 1827. That was the first school in Upper Montclair. And then they built this one in 1849. And then in the 1860s, the schools were reorganized and Mount Hebron District was formed. And so this school became the first Mount Hebron school building. Now this picture was probably taken in 1888 because you notice here it's another Van Alterna slide. And this was definitely taken before 1890. So my guess is this is another picture that this young boy was taking in 1888. So now we're going to jump again, sort of jumping in time as we go on our trip here. We're back to the late 1890s. We're on Bellevue Avenue, and we're looking at some commercial buildings that were built around 1892 to 93. So the first building is the C.S. Shepard Pharmacy, and they were listed in the 1897 directory. The middle building is the Messler General Store and Post Office, operated by Alfred and Joseph Messler. Now, Alfred was the postmaster for the northern part of town starting about 1888. And then the last store there is William Wheeler's Butcher Shop. And later, William Wheeler had a store in Walnut Street. And you can sort of barely make out the Laudenheimer Pharmacy, which was on the cross street on Valley Road. Here we have a church that still stands today, but doesn't look like this. This is the Cliffside Chapel, built in 1880 as a community church. Now, there was a dispute about this church between the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians. Now, the Congregationalists raised the money to build this church with the expectation that their members were going to worship there. But unfortunately, the Presbyterians owned the land to the church, where the church was sitting. And they started trying to make claims on this building the Congregationalists had built. And a dispute broke out. And finally, the Presbyterians sold the property to the Episcopalians, and we have St. James there today. And after World War I, the bell tower replaced the steeple in honor of the people who died in that war. So after that dispute, the Congregationalists moved about a block away on Valley Road. And in 1882, they built the building on the left. And then later that building became the first Commonwealth Clubhouse. Then around 1902 to 1904, they built their current church building on Cooper Avenue. Now, Reverend Howard Bless was a minister at this church from 1894 to 1902, and he was very interested in using lantern slides in his services and Sunday school classes. And the church still has a large lantern slide collection. Now, the old Speartown School we were looking at earlier was just basically a one-room schoolhouse. So it was too small for the growing population. So in 1884, Mount Hebron built the first building on the left. And then in 1893, they built the building on the right. And they were both built on the same site as the current school. And there was another school that was built on that location prior to the one that was standing there today. Now, these next slides I'm showing are just a couple of more slides that were produced for the Board of Education. And I thought they were just nice, colorful scenes of children and probably in Upper Montclair. So here they're playing with like baseball. And here they're having a cookout on the top of the mountain somewhere. This slide is called Eaton Head, Upper Montclair. And I don't know if that bridge still exists somewhere today or not, but it's obviously somewhere on Tony's Brook. So now we'll go downtown Montclair. This is probably in the 1890s. So again, to try to orientate ourselves, this building here is the St. Luke's Church. That was the first building that they had. on St. Luke's Place. And this building here is sort of hard to make out, but it's the Hillside boarding school, where the young ladies that attended the school lived. And now that's the Montclair Inn, where there's a senior citizen facility there. You can make out the central school, the elementary school, and the high school. And that's now our Board of Education buildings. This church sticking out here is the first Congregational church. The first building that they had there at that location was built in the 1870s, and then it burnt down around 1914. So you can see it's a little more built up, but still, you know, it's a lot of open spaces at this point. This is a picture of the Methodist Church on North Fullerton Avenue. Now, the Methodists were actually the first to get themselves organized in Montclair. They had another building that they built on Bloomfield Avenue in 1837. And that building was later purchased by St. Mark's Church and became the first African-American church in town. And the Methodists at that point in 1879 built this building here on North Fullerton Avenue, and it's the same location as their current building. Now, this is an earlier picture. This was taken prior to 1878. It was called the Jacobus Building, and it was a prominent commercial building in town. It was at the corner of Church and South Fullerton Avenue. So on the first floor, they had the D.H. Baldwin Drugstore, Edward Madison Book and Stationery Store, and the Jacobus Boot Shop. And then the upper floors, they had town offices, the Montclair Times, and a meeting hall. Now, on the morning of January 27, 1878, a fire broke out in the basement of this building. And at this time, they didn't have a fire department. So there was really little that they could do. They just quickly got out of control, and it burnt the whole thing to the ground. There was nothing left. But unfortunately, all these businesses were able to continue at other locations. For example, that Edward Mason store went continue for about over a century over on Bloomfield Avenue. And we still, of course, have the Montclair Times today. This picture, I just sort of intrigued me because it really shows how rural Church Street was. This is Church Street, probably taken in the 1890s. You can see the Presbyterian Church sticking out there. And we're probably looking from either Valley Road or Orange Road. I'm not really sure. It was also taken by Edward Van Alterna, probably in the 1890s, my guess. This is a picture of our first firehouse. It was on the corner of Bloomfield Avenue and Valley Road. And it was a volunteer hook and ladder company. And the bell tower, depending on what history you read, was either 54 to 63 feet high. In 1892, they enlarged the building, and that 1892 building was incorporated into the current municipal building. In 1887, they expanded from just having this station to having other stations. So they had the Cliffside Hose Company in Upper Montclair, and then they had stations on Cedar Avenue and South End and on Walnut Street. This was a landmark house in town for a couple of centuries. It was built by William and Mercy Crane in the 1740s. William Crane was the captain of the Spencer Regiment during the Revolutionary War. And his nephew was Nathaniel Crane, who married his daughter Hannah. He was also a major in the with the New Jersey militia during the war. And supposedly the story goes that Washington stayed here in October of 1780 when Lafayette was making his botched attempt to raid Staten Island. But you always have to take these things with a grain of salt. Later, the house was owned by Stephen Crane, who was the grandson of William. And it stood at the corner of Valley and Claremont till sometime in the early 1900s when it was torn down. This is just a picture showing some troops from the Company K of the Spanish-American War. And finally, we'll end our tour at the railroad station in regular Montclair, or downtown Montclair. This was the second building on this side. And on the right is the Mullen livery. That was sort of a building that stood at that location for a number of years. This station was built in 1878 to 79, and then it burnt down in 1891 and was replaced by another building. And then the current buildings that are there today were built in 1913. So how are we doing? So I guess we have about 10 minutes now for Q&A. So I'll try to get myself out of here so we can answer any questions you might have.
That was fun, Beth. Thank you. I enjoyed it. And I enjoyed the introduction, even though you thought it was long. I thought it was really well done. Anybody have any questions? You're welcome to either put them in the chat room and I'll pose them to Beth, or you can just ask them yourself.
The very last picture, was that Lackawanna Plaza?
The last picture I showed was on the same side as the Lackawanna Railroad Station is today.
Oh, okay.
Those are the buildings, I should say.
It was just 3 buildings ago.
Right.
2 buildings before that. Other questions?
This isn't a question, Beth, but I thought those was wonderful. I am absolutely blown away by the quality of those slides and the resolution. I've seen a lot of those pictures before, but the detail was nowhere is clear. You know, you asked me where the Messler shop was and William Wheeler butcher shop was. I didn't know. I guessed. But with the clarity of those slides, that's where they are. They're on Bellevue Avenue, across from what is now the Bellevue Theater, or was the Bellevue Theater. I am blown away by the quality of those slides.
Yeah, that company that they used did a really good job, I thought, of digitizing these slides. So I certainly encourage everybody to, when you get them on, I don't know when you get them onto your digital platform, but take a look at it. There's a lot more images I didn't get to. So I encourage you to go and look at them.
We hope to have them up within, I would say, a month or 2, would you say, Erin? Is that fair? Yeah, hope to have them up in a month or 2. We need to create the metadata so that we can upload them so that people know where they are, as opposed to just seeing pretty pictures of Montclair. I love the ones of the sheep shearing and the local, the guys walking down the street. It's in the middle of rural Montclair. It's a Montclair you don't think about very often.
Right, we don't really realize how rural Montclair was when it first started out. We don't, it's not something we can really imagine. So it's nice to have those pictures that document that.
And a Crane descendant says thank you in the chat room.
Okay.
Are you descended from William and Mercy, do you know? Don't know.
Well, Stephen Crane, yes, is a many generation great grandfather.
Cool.
So yeah, and I've been to the Crane house to visit, and I just thought that was great. the Montclair History Center is a wonderful thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions about some of the pictures that Beth has shown tonight?
I love the artist ones, and I know that Beth said that Erin would be showing more. I know I got a little sneak peek. I'm on the board, saw some of the ones that are coming, but those were very interesting.
Yeah, they're definitely,
Look
I would
forward to
say, the
seeing
real
more of them.
gems of the collection. Yeah. So
And I want to mention that that is in 2 weeks when Erin will be doing the art colony. And then some of you saw the Scientific American program that Deborah did last year, where she found the houses that were in Scientific America Architects and Builders Edition, and she did a then and now with them, and she's identified more. And so we've got the sequel on that coming up in 4 weeks. We also have the herb sale starting next Thursday. So if you ordered them in advance, come pick them up on Thursday. And if you didn't order them in advance, there's plenty there anyway. So come, and I hope you shop either next Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. Again, if you haven't put it in the chat room, if you're more than one person, let us know that. And also, if you're watching from more than 20 miles away, let us know that. So let's see, did the photographers label their slides, or is it up to the viewer to figure things out?
well, of course, I wasn't looking at the original slides, and it's been a while since I've seen them. I was working from a list that Erin gave me, which identified all the images. But just to answer this in general, a lot of times the photographers did have little labels on their slides, which would identify what they were. So my guess is there probably is some sort of label on these slides which indicate what they are. Otherwise, I don't know how we would know today what some of these things are that don't even exist anymore.
Erin, can you talk about how the slides are labeled?
Yeah, a lot of them were labeled. They might have been more vague than anything. So I'm not sure who did. Somebody a few years ago did a wonderful inventory of about 200 of the slides in our collection. We have over 600 lantern slides in our collection, and just about half of that got digitized. So 200 of the total collection was inventoried at some point. And I think somebody must have done some extra research, because there's definitely some slides in there that have been identified and they are correctly identified, but the slide itself doesn't say. I think a couple of those include some of the artist colony ones. So I'm not, some of them are identified, but I think a little bit of digging and some detective work had to go into correctly identifying some of them.
And Deb says, I agree, the slides are very clear, and she loved the one on Bellevue Avenue with the dog in the foreground. I love that dog in the foreground. I agree, Deb. Buffalo. Okay, anybody else? All right. Well, thank you, Beth, for doing that. That was wonderful. Maybe we'll have a part 2 with some more slides, but non-artist colony, because Erin's doing that next week or in 2 weeks. So hope to see you all at the herb sale, and then again 2 weeks from tonight. Take care, everybody. Be safe. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Great job.
Bye.
Right,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Beth.